Tantor Audio presents 1940, FDR, Willkie, Lindbergh, Hitler, The Election Amid the Storm, by Susan Dunn. Narrated by Corey Snow. Chapter 1. Mystery in the White House. On the mild November morning of Election Day, November 5, 1940, Franklin Roosevelt, his wife Eleanor, and his mother Sarah cast their votes in Hyde Park's little town hall. "Your name, please," said the young chairwoman of the election board. "Franklin D. Roosevelt," came the hearty reply. She nodded but did not ask his occupation as she had 4 years ago when Mr. Roosevelt replied, "Farmer." This time the question was unnecessary, she said, because everybody knows who he is. Outside, a jovial Roosevelt posed patiently for photographers. "Will you wave to the trees, Mr. President?" asked one of them. "Go climb a tree," Roosevelt said with a laugh before obediently waving at the trees for the cameras. Dutchess County, with its majestic elms and maples, its farms and tranquil estates along the Hudson River, was Franklin Roosevelt's boyhood home, the place to which he always returned. Yet he could be sure that this year, as in 1932 and 1936, he would fail to carry the county. That morning, Roosevelt's Republican opponent, Wendell L. Willkie, and his wife Edith, accompanied by their 20-year-old son Philip, a student at Princeton, voted at Public School 6 on Madison Avenue and 85th Street in New York City, a few blocks from their apartment on Fifth Avenue. During the campaign, the thoughtful, pro-business Willkie had attacked Roosevelt's economic policies, arguing that they stifled growth. But Willkie was also an internationalist who repeatedly stressed to voters that our way of life is in competition with Hitler's way of life. He adamantly ruled out any compromise with fascist aggression or with religious and racial persecution or the destruction of human lives and liberty. As the Willkies entered the school, people on the sidewalk cheered, "We want Willkie!" Surrounded by flashing news cameras, the boyishly handsome candidate smiled broadly and waved to the crowd. Before returning home, he drove through Central Park and then along Riverside Drive. Afterward, he rested and then left for his headquarters in the Commodore Hotel. 10 miles away, in Englewood, New Jersey, Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne lunched at the home of Anne's mother, Elizabeth Morrow, before going to the polls. Lindbergh hoped that Willkie would win the presidency. "I do not believe he is a great leader," he confided to his diary that day, "and I doubt that he has much understanding of the problems in Europe, but regardless of these failings, I think he would be far preferable to Roosevelt." The fearless young aviator with a disarming smile, whose unprecedented 33-hour transatlantic flight in the single-engine, single-seat Spirit of St. Louis in May 1927 had thrilled the world, was now the principal spokesman for American isolationism. Intoxicated with admiration for Nazi Germany's advances in aviation, he had hammered Roosevelt for failing to appease Hitler, sourly blaming him for having alienated the most powerful military nations of both Europe and Asia. Lindbergh's wife pitched in, too. Anne Morrow Lindbergh's eloquent best-selling book, The Wave of the Future, published just that October, predicted a new dynamic and dazzling age of fascism in the United States. "No candidate ever felt secure until the votes were counted," commented Roosevelt's Attorney General Robert Jackson. FDR, too, Jackson said, never overlooked or discounted the possibilities of defeat. In 1932, Roosevelt had easily triumphed over incumbent Herbert Hoover, carrying 42 states to Hoover's 6. 4 years later, at Hyde Park on election night, as the astonishing results trickled in, FDR leaned back in his chair, blew a ring of cigarette smoke at the ceiling, and exclaimed, "Wow!" He had beaten the moderate Republican Alf Landon of Kansas by a vote of 27,752,309 to 16,682,524, and by 523 electoral votes to 8. Only the states of Maine and Vermont had gone for Landon. Roosevelt elected by landslide, announced newspapers all over the country on November 4, 1936. It was a Democratic tidal wave, marveled the Washington Post. The confetti and ticker tape that rained down on the crowd in New York's Times Square on election eve reached blizzard proportions, according to the New York Times. But this time was different. Now the president had good reason to be nervous. He had a strong and intelligent opponent in Wendell Willkie, who for months had been pounding away at the third-term candidate. In addition, Lindbergh and the powerful isolationist movement had mounted a virulent offensive against Roosevelt, and the GOP had made a striking comeback in the 1938 midterm elections. Though Democrats kept their majorities in both chambers of Congress, Republicans picked up 8 Senate seats, nearly doubled their strength in the House, and even gained a dozen new governorships. 2 days after that election, syndicated columnist Walter Lippmann wrote that it was not too rash to predict a total Republican victory in 1940. In November 1940, voters all over the country were once again judging their president. They could think back to the abyss of the Great Depression and the avalanche of legislation during FDR's first and second 100 days, new programs that gave Americans new economic security, protection for their homes and farms, labor rights, a minimum wage, and even electricity. But in the last 6 months, a shift had taken place as the international crisis eclipsed the New Deal. This year, the election was taking place against a background of world catastrophe as Japanese warplanes attacked China and as European democracies from Norway to France yielded to the shocking speed of Hitler's army of fire and steel, his relentlessly advancing troops, tanks, and screaming dive bombers. While politicians on all sides of the political spectrum spoke about the importance of preparedness and a strong defense, American boys registered not for civilian conservation corps camps or for Works Progress Administration jobs, but instead for the country's first peacetime draft, and tens of thousands of workers flocked to new jobs in defense plants that were turning out planes, ships, and weapons. The weekend before Election Day, the Gallup poll reported that Roosevelt still held the lead, but that there appeared to be a strong trend toward Willkie. George Gallup, the head of the American Institute of Public Opinion, a Republican and a Willkie supporter, judged that it would be the closest election in a quarter century. The competing Dunn survey of indicators of public opinion was less circumspect, confidently predicting that Willkie would win with 364 electoral votes. "This fellow Willkie is about to beat the boss," said a worried Harry Hopkins, FDR's close advisor. All around the country, Willkie received enthusiastic endorsements from the largely Republican national press. A rare editorial voice in Roosevelt's corner was the Chicago Defender, the nation's largest African-American newspaper. "No administration in our history," the Defender reminded its readers, "has done more than the New Deal to achieve economic and social democracy. It would be suicidal for the masses to place their faith in Wendell Willkie, who promises everything from a bag of peanuts to a shooting star." But almost every major newspaper in America favored Willkie. His election as president would be most likely to preserve the traditional restraints and balances of the American system of government, wrote the New York Times as it condemned Roosevelt's impatience with the 2 other branches of government. "The indispensable man in this time of national crisis is Wendell Willkie," editorialized the Los Angeles Times. Papers like the Hartford Courant and the Washington Post concurred. "If Willkie is elected," the Post wrote, "we are willing to predict that he will make a truly great president of the United States." William Allen White, the famous editor of the Emporia, Kansas Gazette, and Theodore Roosevelt's old friend, also came out for Willkie. Whereas FDR had always lived on inherited wealth, White wrote, Willkie had risen from modest origins in Indiana to the pinnacle of success as the head of the Commonwealth and Southern Corporation, the nation's largest electric utility holding company. "The GOP candidate has what it takes," White concluded, "and best of all, he is fighting for the old, hard way of American life. We are for Willkie." Also rooting for Willkie were the Nazis. "Despite Willkie's almost outdoing the president in his promises to work for Britain's victory," wrote CBS's sharp foreign correspondent William Shirer from Berlin, "the Nazis ardently wished the Republican candidate to win. Shirer surmised that the Germans believed that even if Willkie turned out to be their enemy, they would at least have several months of indecision before he